Kia ora tātou, the House is resumed. Members, prior to the dinner hour, we were debating part 1 of the Parental Leave and Employment Protection 6 months paid leave amendment bill. David Seymour had the call, has 2 minutes and 11 seconds remaining should he wish to avail himself.
Thank you, Mr Chairman, and I do indeed wish to avail myself of this remaining 2 minutes and 11 seconds, or whatever's now left of that, as my contribution to the committee stage debating part 1 of this bill. And Mr Chair, when one of your fellow presiding officers was here, I was just making the point that there are actually very interesting stages of development throughout a child's life, and the question of whether we should be voting in this House to extend the eligibility for paid parental leave from 18 weeks to 22 weeks on the 1st of January in 2017 is really a question that has to be put in the context of those other developmental stages. And just to give you an idea, Mr Speaker, I was referring to the development of language and the various stages of a child's development at which language becomes an important factor because a child has reached a milestone in linguistic development and the way that that affects the development of brain capacity. And indeed, Mr Speaker, language is very important as an explanation for why humans have much larger brains in comparison to their body size to other species. But Mr Speaker, I'd also preface that by talking about the very real personal experience of a close friend of mine who gave birth at or near the 1st of April this year, when there was a 4-week increase in the period of eligibility for paid parental leave and the effect that that had on them. And I just make the point, Mr Speaker, that ultimately, Mr Chair, sorry, ultimately, that particular increase, while attractive, was really not critical because it occurs in such a long context. And Mr Chair, you could also make the point that, Mr Chair.
David Seymour.
And the reason for that, Mr Chair, might be that this particular amendment will not affect the overwhelming majority of parents. Because, Mr Chair, as it's been noted in earlier debates, there are approximately 60,000 children born in New Zealand each year, and only approximately 26,000 parents actually take advantage of paid parental leave. So the premise that we've been asked to accept by the opposition and the member in charge of this bill is that paid parental leave makes such a substantial difference that it is critical to the upbringing of a child that it's critical tonight that we increase the period of time for which a child qualifies as rapidly as possible, that we do that in time for January the 1st next year. And yet, Mr Chair, how can it be simultaneously true that this 4-week increase is so important to the welfare of children, and yet, at the same time, we find that the majority of parents will not be affected whatsoever because they do not take up any amount of paid parental leave for any length of time. Mr Chair, the other interesting thing about this bill, or this particular amendment to move from 18 to 22, is that it actually is very poorly targeted at people who really need additional care and an additional resource. And Mr Chair, you might contrast that with an amendment the government has recently made to paid parental leave that extends it for babies who are born prematurely. Now, you can look at the data that this government increasingly has when it chooses to direct the state's resources to increasing outcomes for children. And what we find, for instance, from the outcomes of the Dunedin study, which was presented in an excellent lecture to parliamentarians over the dinner break, and it's a shame that more did not take advantage of it, was that actually this bill would make an extension of the of state resource to around about 45% of kids born in an indiscriminate manner. In reality, this government now has a lot of data through its social investment framework to show that rather than wholesale increases and applying extra resources for an additional 4 weeks to 45% of children whose parents have self-selected to apply for and receive their paid parental leave entitlement, this bill is actually going to lack the targeting that could be so much better in terms of getting outcomes by applying resources to those who are in greatest need. And let me, Mr Chair, give you a few examples. From this rich data set that the government now has available and that we should be applying scarce resources to rather than applying them wholesale.
Point of order, Ian Lees-Galloway.
Speaking about the bill in broad terms, he's not really addressing part one, which I think he should be doing at this point.
Well, speaking to the point of order, David Seymour.
Mr Chair, I can absolutely assure you that I am speaking to the question of whether this part, which wholesale extends resources to a wide range of the population, is the most efficient way to apply resources.
Okay. Well, I'm ready to make a ruling, and the member will know I've already given one signal to keep it narrow. While the member may well have been speaking to that up here, he needs to be delivered because it's not what he's thinking that's in or out. As far as relevancy goes, it's what he says. So if he can keep bringing that back to his 22 weeks over the next minute and 14 seconds, he'll be doing great.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I suspect that my greatest challenge of all is to ensure not only that I'm thinking it here, speaking it here, but also that you, Mr Chair, are hearing it here. And so let me continue.
Don't go there.
Let me continue by saying that there has been raised in this debate by members who are in favour of the bill and members who are opposed to the bill and opposed to this part and in favour of this part, that it is the best, or in some speakers' cases, an inefficient use of the government's resource to have a wholesale increase in the entitlement from all for all parents from 18 weeks to 22 weeks, when arguably, given the resources that the government has in terms of data, they could be better targeting that resource. That is a very important consideration for members of this House listening to the debate, but also for those people at home and those parents at home who might ask, if we are going to have a social contract where we pay an amount of tax, Mr Chair.
David Seymour, final call.
If we are going to have a policy where a scarce taxpayer resource is utilised in order to achieve better outcomes for all of our children in this country, then would we not be better to ensure that that investment is informed by the best data that we have? And simply saying we wish to extend from 18 to 22 weeks on January the 1st, 2017, Mr Chair, is far too arbitrary, given that there is so much need out there and we need to do so much better for our children, and yet we find ourselves with a government who is not prepared to use the relevant data, is not prepared to target resources towards need, but is instead content to say, rather arbitrarily, and as I made in the case of my friend Mr Chair, it does seem rather arbitrary in the wider consideration of parenting that is required, rather arbitrarily tried to extend paid parental leave to 22 weeks on a particular day. Mr Chair, why might that be? Well, Mr Chair, we actually can look at the motivations behind a part such as this and the history of those who have moved such part. Because, Mr Chair, public policy exists in a political context. Public policies that are not politically sustainable will not be sustained in a country. So it's worthwhile examining what previous speakers have said about initiatives such as this and their attempts to justify them. As far back as 2002, the Labour Party introduced paid parental leave. I think it was to only 12 weeks. They would have argued at that time that it simply was not fiscally responsible to further extend paid parental leave. Of course, Mr Chair, what's interesting about 2002 is that it was an election year. So I'm building the case, Mr Chair, that we are not talking about extending paid parental leave from 18 weeks to 22 because there's any evidential basis that this is the best use of taxpayer funds for making children better and for allowing them to develop into stronger and better citizens. Mr Chair, there is a history where actually this type of policy has been proposed in years such as 2002, which was an election year. The Labour Party again moved an amendment or a change in the law similar to this in 2004, at exactly the time that there was a major change in the polling fortunes of the party that year. Mr Chair, the interesting thing is that those were quite modest extensions of paid parental leave. They got us from 0 to 12 and 12 to 14 weeks. But, Mr Chair, the interesting thing is that at that time, the government had much larger fiscal surpluses than it has now. This is why targeting is so important. Today, we live in a time when compared to 2002 or 2004, when we had large fiscal surpluses and political pressure on the Labour Party and government, there were modest extensions. The extensions today are constrained by a much smaller amount of fiscal headroom and, frankly, a lot more pressure on taxpayers who have suffered from acute fiscal drag since that time. So when we look back at the history, we can unpack some of the Labour Party's motivations, and it's not about the welfare of children. If it was, why do only 46% of parents who are eligible actually take it up? It's not about stages of development, because, as I've argued, there are so many other critical stages of development that 22 weeks or even 26 weeks, which I'm looking forward to debating in part 2, will miss. Mr Speaker, it is simply about political posturing on behalf of the Labour Party to attempt to raise the age of entitlement. And when you gather up the evidence that we've seen throughout the history of this particular topic, and when you gather up the evidence from child development, when you gather up the fiscal record of various governments when they have attempted to increase the eligibility for paid parental leave, what you find is that, Mr Chair.
No, I pushed the button all by myself. Members, the question is that Part 1